in case. Let's go ahead and get started here. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the ACCE 2022 Hawaii Catholic Schools Annual Conference virtually. I am James Morris, and I'm your moderator for session 404, Reaching Students Who Are Neuro-Diverse with Dr. Cynthia Norall. Cynthia Norall, PhD, is a licensed educational psychologist with a PhD in education from the University of Santa Barbara. She is a board-certified behavior analyst, doctorate level. Specializing in the diagnosis and treatment of Asperger's syndrome in children and teens for the past decade, Dr. Norall founded the Friends Club in 2000. Created as a safe haven, a special place where the socially challenged boys and girls could come together on a weekly basis, grouped by age and gender, the Friends Club teaches basic people skills and social awareness, which do not come naturally to Asperger individuals. This session will be about 1 hour. You can enter your questions via the chat option if that is available, and it should be. And we will answer questions if time allows. Let us pray. Let us put ourselves in the presence of the Lord. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. God of love and life, thank you for the abundant blessings you have bestowed on us all. Help us to look deep within ourselves and discover the gifts you have blessed us with, and to receive your gifts with great joy. We thank you for the gift of our presenter today. May you guide and inspire her to share her knowledge with us as we open our eyes, ears, and hearts to what we are about to learn, and may it help us become better educators for our students each day. We ask all of this through Christ our Lord, amen. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let us welcome warmly Dr. Cynthia Norall.
Thank you so much. I'm so pleased to be here. I'm actually in California. I would love to be there right now, although we have incredibly beautiful weather here. And I'm very pleased to be talking to all of you who work in Catholic education, as I went through Catholic school from first grade all the way through high school. So my first public school was actually going to UC Davis. I am going to go ahead and share my screen and hopefully do this. So my talk today, and it's not a new term to use, neurodiverse. I wanted my talk not to be just specific to autism and Asperger's, and I can spend some time talking about the difference between autism and Asperger's, and I'm not going to, because as I talk about neurodiversity, I think I'll be sharing a bit more about the clients that I have, but also the students that you would have that would be on what we now call the high end or high functioning autism, which back a few years ago used to be called Asperger's. So I'm going to go back and forth between that. I'm also going to go back and forth between neurodiverse versus neurotypical, and neurodiverse versus social thinkers. So if I get a little confusing, just let me know, and I can stop if I'm saying a term that may not be as well known. A little bit about me. I am a licensed educational psychologist. I'm bilingual. I speak Spanish. I started as a school psychologist, and in the 1990s, when the whole field of autism in education was kind of opening up, that's where I was meant to be. I feel that I've been given a gift in understanding this population. I love talking about neurodiversity and kids that think differently and have different wiring, because it's such, they lend so much to us if we can understand them, and we can facilitate and mediate for them. I'm an autism expert. I've done due process, I've done family law, and helping parents with custody situations. I am a board certified behavior analyst, so I do look at behaviors, but I always look at behaviors in relation to social and the social challenges that these students have. And I did start Friends Club, and I do have a book. So let's get started. So this is the terminology neurodiversity. It's been around since 1998, and sociologist Judy Singer and also a journalist, Harvey Bloom, came up with it. It refers to a variation in the human brain regarding sociability, learning, attention, mood, or other mental functions in a non-pathological sense. And I had put out, thank you, those that put questions into the discussion, because I had a question about, can we talk about those that have brain injuries and concussions and things like that? And when you're looking at the definition of neurodiversity, it separates those out, as in, oh, I'll have to come back to Hans. We are realizing that autism, ADHD, and other conditions emerge through a combination of genetic predisposition and environmental interaction. They are not the result of disease or injury. So I am not going to be talking about specifically about concussions, I think was the question, and brain injury. I'm talking more about just genetically how the brain is wired in neurodiversity. And if you think of the bell curve, neurotypical is in that middle of the bell curve, you know, when you have the low average to the high average, and neurodiversity is that other side, at the right side, if you're looking at the bell curve. So it's not neurotypical, it's not considered within the average range, but there are factors, characteristics that can blend in from that range. One of my mentors, Dr. Tony Atwood, who's in Australia, talks about how even ADHD kind of sits into that neurodiverse range, but it's not fully into the autism spectrum. And if you think about it, it has to do with differences in the frontal lobe of the brain. And there are studies that have been done that show those differences. And I can talk about that when we get to the end if you want to know more about some of those brain studies, because I think it's really interesting. I passed up one slide that was Hans Asperger talking, and I need to think about how to get back to that slide. Here we go. I think this will get me back. Hans Asperger in 1944 wrote this when he was talking about a group of children that were extremely bright, but had a lot of the stereotypic behaviors that you see they were defining at the time in the 1940s and called autism. But this is what he said, and I think this is really important to think about. These children often show a surprising sensitivity to the personality of the teacher. However difficult they are under optimal conditions, they can be guided and taught, but only by those who give them true understanding and genuine affection. People who show kindness towards them, and yes, humor. Humor really works well with this population. So I'm going to go forward again. So we're identifying diseases. We are in our society identifying diseases and injuries, both physical and environmental, that will produce brain injuries whose effects look very similar to autism and other differences. But acceptance of neurodiversity certainly does not include passive acceptance of such injury and insult, though we should unconditionally accept individuals who were so impacted. So I'm not really talking so much about those with the brain injuries. I have had some clients that have had illnesses that have then, after that, they've got like the stereotypic kinds of behaviors that you see with autism. Also, children who are blind will sometimes show the same type of finger flicking and stereotypic behaviors that you will see with autism. And again, I want to differentiate what we're going to be talking about today is that those that are more, it's wired, it's more genetic. It's kind of just who they are. It isn't something that they had an assault to their brain in development. So here's a couple of different things that you can probably hear out there. I do find it depends on which lens is looking at the child. So you've got the ADHD, you've got autism spectrum, and that's if you got the developmental psychologist looking at the child, pediatricians, psychiatrists, because autism spectrum is in the DSM, which is the diagnostic manual. Asperger's is no longer in the DSM. It used to be, before we got DSM-5, it was taken out and it was just kind of more broadly autism spectrum disorder. If you pull out a book, the DSM version prior to the DSM-5, you would see that the differentiation with Asperger's is that they have verbal language within typical ranges of other children, neurotypical children. And the other piece is that they measure within the average to high average to superior range of intellectual ability. Those are kind of the differences that differentiate at the time the Asperger's from the autism, the more classic, what I call the more classic autism. If you're a speech and language person, you might be looking at it as social pragmatic challenges because you're looking at from a language. You might have a student that instead of having an official diagnosis of autism, it says it's a social pragmatic challenge. To me, it's all kind of one and the same, but there are those disciplines that do like to differentiate. The other that you might hear is nonverbal learning disabilities, and that's where when they've done the IQ testing, they see that their verbal abilities are so much higher than their nonverbal abilities. So they call that a disability, a learning disability. Again, to me, it's kind of all wrapped into one. Sensory regulation disorder, that's if you're looking at it as you're an OT and you're looking at sensory processing. I'm going to be talking about how they process some of their sensory. So that will be something that we'll talk about. To me, this all wraps into one, into neurodiversity. If you're trying to get services in the school, and you are obviously because you're private, but if you're over in the DOE, I do believe for an IEP, and I do a lot of educational advocacy, I do believe that calling it autism is the best way to get the student services. I understand why people don't want to. They want to say, oh, you know, I've got these things, and maybe keep away from the word autism. I do get that with families. But I have found in the 30 years I've been working in the schools, and I did work over there in the DOE because I was a vendor. We did provide services, and for the Early Start program, I do believe, it's my personal opinion, professional opinion, I should say, that autism does open up some more doors within services. That's not the focus of my talk today, but I do want to mention that because I often am asked that question. Thank you, those of you that put some questions in the discussion. I realize there's so many of you today that if I had you all kind of put questions into the chat, but I am going to have time at the end to answer some questions as well, but thank you. And then there was one person that asked about mediating, and I do actually already have slides about that, so that's perfect. Okay, hopefully you can see this. I thought this was fabulous. I pulled it off from, and I've got it at the, where I got it from, about the ADHD iceberg, because I think as adults, when we think about ADHD, we think of the kid that like above the top of the iceberg is just the trouble focusing, fidgeting, what we'd say jumping off the walls. But if you look at this, and I do have a grown daughter who has ADHD, so I also speak to this kind of as a parent, watching her grow up through the school system. But look at all of the different things that kind of come in with ADHD: sensory processing disorder, anxiety, uncontrollable fidgeting, hyperfixations, mood swings, depression, difficulty following and maintaining conversations, executive function. All of these things you can see kind of fits in to that whole, when I'm talking about the autism spectrum, it does kind of fit in, and it makes sense why Dr. Atwood says when you're looking at that bell curve and you're looking at this side of it, how parts of it can fall, and ADHD seems to be along those lines. I just thought this was a fabulous slide just showing us what's kind of underneath there and all the things that can be going on. They can go together. You can have students that have both a diagnosis of autism and a diagnosis of ADHD, but they're not exclusive. So just because they have ADHD doesn't mean they necessarily have all of the features of autism. And just because they have autism doesn't mean that their attending issues are the same as the ADHD. It has to do with their fixations, but it also, not their fixations. It has to do with what their presentation of those attention difficulties are. In general, you would think of a child with attention deficit disorder kind of pays attention to kind of everything. And a child on the autism spectrum hyper-focuses on that one thing. So it's a different look when you're talking about the attending issues. If you have both, I do have a current client that I'm supporting, actually had his IEP today, and we're discussing him. His mother said it really well. He has both diagnoses and definitely fits both. She says, the autism in him wants order and wants some control, but the ADHD side of him loves chaos and exists kind of in that chaos, and that's where the creative side comes. And so she described it as the two kind of fighting each other. And he is not a student who benefits from any type of medication. All of the schools mention medication many, many times, but he has so many adverse effects from medication. And that often occurs when you have both going on at the same time, because the stimulant medication that you can give a child with autism will often make them even more anxious and actually create some, can create some tics and accentuate their anxiety and make life even worse for them. So sometimes you can't even think about medication. Okay, so in the neurodiverse student, facts are shared, thoughts are not shared. Why are thoughts not shared? Thoughts are not shared because there's a mind blindness. What's in my head is already in your head. Why should I tell you what's in my head? Okay. And a lot of the teaching around perspective taking, and this other person has this different perspective than yours, is really the hallmark of being neurodiverse, is that I have to learn how social thinkers think if I'm neurodiverse, because that's not how I'm wired. I'm not wired to immediately look at another person doing something and have an assumption about what they're thinking or what they're feeling. I'm not wired that way. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just not how I'm wired, and I need some help in understanding that. Now, we know that social thinking begins at before 6 months of age, because the baby has to be anticipating what mom is thinking or feeling, and learns to take in the facial characteristics, to take in mannerisms and emotions, and learns all of those things to be able to read another person. And if you're not wired for that, that doesn't develop at 6 months. So there's definitely a difference from birth. Their special interest is vast knowledge. The meeting I had today is a student that really gets history, and we're actually using his ability, his reward is that he gets to attend his history class versus a social studies class, because he loves history so much. And the teacher shared today, he has more knowledge than I do. And the mom said, yeah, that is his special interest. And I kind of believe that the brain is opened up and all that information is stuffed in there. And unfortunately, it can be it's in competition with learning other things that are not as interesting to them. Compliments, this is really important. Us social thinkers, we like compliments. We like when somebody tells us our hair looks good, our work is good, we've done a nice job. You know, what we're wearing today looks really nice. We like those things because that makes us feel connected to people. And we have a process we go through when we hear compliments. They don't need compliments because in their mind, you already know you look good. You already know you did a good job. So it's not, they have to be taught to actually give other people compliments because to them, compliments are known facts. I have some funny stories around that. Hopefully I get to tell some of my anecdotes. I asked one of my clients once, this was a while ago when I was putting together slides around Friends Club. And I said, what is a friend to you? My friend Max said, a friend is like family with a different last name. So a different perspective. Social coaching, I'm going to be talking about this. And I know somebody actually asked the question about how best do we mediate between them and their peers, especially when you're in the classroom or if you're out on the playground with them, or you have for example, you have a group project they're working on and you've got to help facilitate this perspective taking. I call that social coaching. And I call it social coaching because what you're really doing is you're coaching them to be a social partner, to be a social thinker. You may have a student in your class who's neurodiverse that you don't even need to teach. You don't need to teach how to read. A lot of these students are what we call hyperlexic. They learn how to read, just we almost don't know how it comes together. So they don't need to learn in the same way that another neurotypical student would need to learn to read, but they do need the social that a neurotypical student doesn't need the help in. My kids grew up with me running my agency and doing Friends Club, and they would come to Friends Club with me. And so they could see me because those were always in the after school and in the evening. So if they wanted to see mom, they knew they had to come down and help me out in Friends Club. And my daughter told me something very, very insightful one day. She says, Mommy, I like helping you. I like being here, but I already know all the stuff you're teaching them. That stuff I already know. And I said, yeah, exactly. We're teaching them stuff that they don't know, just like there's things that you need to be taught that you don't know. And if we kind of keep that understanding that there's some things we're not going to have to teach them, then it makes it a little easier to understand when you need to do the social coaching. Honoring their thinking. This is a little bit about how neurodiverse students think. Numbers are in their head. They shouldn't have to show you their work. And I used to really advocate that they didn't have to show their work because, you know, I thought, well, that's really important. And then I actually in a meeting was challenged by a high school math teacher. No. If they don't show their work, then I can never know if they've got the processes right. And so I actually come up with a compromise sometimes where I say you need to show your work on at least one problem or two problems, or if you get the answer wrong, you have to go back and show your work so we can find out where it got wrong. But they really do process things in their head that is very different in their wiring. They have very honest responses. This is something I love about this population and about people that are neurodiverse, is that they're very honest. The problem is it often ticks off us social thinkers because they were so honest. We see it as rude or we see it as offensive. And I think sometimes we need to just use a little bit more humor and be able to say, well, I think what you're trying to say is, and another way to say that would be, because I think we need to kind of honor their honesty. They don't tell lies. They have to actually learn how to lie. It isn't something they just pick up, because to lie is to tell somebody something that isn't true. And because they're such purveyors of the truth, that's going to be really hard for them. They have their own sense of humor. Here's something interesting. I learned this in putting together some lesson plans years ago for Friends Club. And that was, I thought, okay, I want to teach humor. Okay, and then humor is something we enjoy and it's kind of social. And if I tell you a joke and you laugh, oh yeah, you know, we've got this whole connection. Well, guess what? To them, humor is what's funny to them. It's not about sharing, having this shared enjoyment. It's that if they get a joke and they think it's really funny, they're going to tell it again and again and again and again. And that is because each time they tell it, they're getting joy out of it. It's driving everybody else crazy. Oh, I've heard that one again. You know, you told me that already. So we have to teach them, you know, that humor is something to be shared. And when others are laughing, and I have something at the end that I actually use for them to do that. Again, a different perspective. And the most important thing I hope you walk away from is it's not meant to be taken personal. There are children, there are students that just want to turn your buttons and push your buttons and really get under your skin. This population is not that. They're not trying. And as a matter of fact, when I've gone back and done like a debriefing with a student after they've had an unsuccessful social interaction or they've gotten themselves in trouble, when I take them back and I tell them that people believe that their intent was to do something mean or to do something offensive, they are so taken back because that is not their intent. They're not out there to get at people. Does it feel like it to us social thinkers? Yes, but I think we have to remember from their perspective, their intent is not to push our buttons. And so we can't take it personally. And that's so hard for us social thinkers not to do. When we facilitate the social, we need to teach them, I was just on Kauai, so this picture is from a bunch of us in Kauai, but recognition of a problem, belief that the problem that can be solved. So we need to first help them to understand that there is a problem. We need to have them have the belief that we can solve it. Knowledge that somebody can help, it's usually an adult. Sometimes it could be a peer, and we know peers that can be great facilitators. And then we also need to teach a willingness to learn the social skills because it's going to gain new relationships that are going to help them get that help. Really important, this comes up in the classroom a lot, is giving a direction, not a question. What that means is it's time to get your math books out rather than, do you want to get your math books out? Or it's time to do math rather, do you want to do math now? We have to honor if we say, do you want to do math now? And they say no, you've asked a question. And so we need to also teach them, again, we need a, something that we need to do, but we need to also teach them when Miss Smith says, do you want to get your math books out? What that means is it's time to get your math books. So we got to do both sides. We've got to honor what their response is, but we also have to think about what do we need to teach them so that they can be more successful in the classroom. And instructions, this is really important too, and this is good teaching, so I'm probably speaking to the choir here, but we need to make sure that we have a delivery of instruction where it's clear and concise. It's clear to them what we're telling them to do, but we don't need to repeat it. I think what often happens to neurodiverse children is because they don't turn and look at you, or they don't have their body in your direction, there's a sense that they didn't hear you, so we repeat it. But what happens to that neurodiverse brain is that every time you repeat it, you go back to try to process it. So it's kind of like resetting your computer. One of my clients said it, yeah, that's like when you reboot your computer and you go back and then you got to wait for everything to get going again, and you can process it. And so the worst thing that we can be doing when we think they haven't heard us is to just repeat it. What we should do is give a moment and then say, I don't think you heard me, or maybe you weren't listening. We need to kind of bring them back to, oh, I'm supposed to be listening. There's something I'm supposed to do right now. Just hit the door behind me. There's something I need to do right now. That gives them that little bit of, oh, okay, that's what I'm supposed to do, rather than trying to repeat the whole direction and they have to process exactly what the direction was. Write it down. I cannot tell you how many times just having a whiteboard, a piece of paper, something that I really wanted the student to know and to process and to do was to write it down. It takes the focus off the adult. It's not me telling them, it's a piece of paper telling them, and that black and white is so powerful. And it also allows a chance to process the expectation. They can read it, okay, yeah, that's what it means. Because that auditory and taking in all of the sensory and everything that can be going on at the time sometimes just gets overwhelming, and it allows that chance to process whatever is the expectation. Social stories, you might have heard of social stories. That's what social stories are about. You know, it's a story that kind of says this is the scenario and these are the expectations and this is what I'm expected to do. I do it we write down lists. You know, how many of us get up in the morning and we write down lists so we keep our schedule, or we check our calendar? You know, visuals are so important. How do we know which lanes of the road to be driving on? How do we know, you know, where we're supposed to stop? You know, one-way streets. So the visual is really your tool in your pocket to always have. If you have a student and they're not getting their books out, they're not following a direction, write something down on a whiteboard or a little piece of paper and go over and just put it on the desk, point to it, don't say anything, just point to it and move on. And you'll see how powerful that actually is and that works when we're talking for the visuals, that works if you have attention deficit disorder as well, because you're trying to figure out what I'm supposed to be paying attention to, and that really helps to focus. Color coding is really important too. Highlighting, when you give them a worksheet, highlighting what parts they need to get started with, that helps that. Before I get into I'm going to go back to that one. You know, another term I should have put earlier with the ADHD, the social pragmatic, and that I also should have put executive functioning disorder. Some of you have probably heard that students in your class have this issue. Executive functioning has to do with the ability to prioritize, to plan, and to execute. So a student that is having difficulty initiating, so you say, okay, it's time to get started on your work, and you come back, you go and you see what all the other students are doing, and you get back to the student and it still hasn't started his work. That's a problem with initiating. That falls under this area of executive functioning. There's actually a part of the brain that we need working on all parts at all times in order to help us to do that. So if you are doing worksheets or you're doing, you know, a project and you want them to understand kind of the priority, the sequence of events, where you can number it out, you probably do this already, number it out, or you can highlight or code, give them a code so they understand what they're going to do. Then it doesn't just look like gobbledygook when something is put in front of them, and that visual is very important. It's not that all students that are neurodiverse have auditory processing challenges. So I'm not making a blanket statement, but the majority of the students that are neurodiverse that I've met over the years, and I've been doing this for a long time, said a decade, I think it was meant to say 3 decades because I started in 1987. But the majority of the students are visual learners and not auditory learners. And the visual is very powerful to a person who's neurodiverse because it's black and white, and because they like to know what is exactly the rule. It's really powerful to use visuals. I find myself, if I go in a classroom, I'm looking around to see, are visuals being used? I even close my eyes to see, is there too much auditory going on? I have a real good sense of that when I go in and I do an observation in the classroom of how it is for my student who's neurodiverse. And it's just based upon how much are we using of the visuals. A little bit about reading others. We don't think about it because our brains were wired to just do this very naturally. There's so many subtle cues. There was a study done that took a look at students on the spectrum, where their eyes were looking when they were looking at people. And they did it with cameras and all kinds of computer fun stuff. But what they found is they didn't focus on this part of the head. They focused only on the mouth. And I had a client once, he's now a young adult who's gone to UC Berkeley. But I had a client, and he and I were talking one time, and I was talking about looking at the eyes and, you know, how much information you get about a person in this area here. And he said to me, "Why should I look there?" And I said, "What do you mean?" And he says, "The words come out of the mouth. That's where you got to look." And so there's so many subtle cues that occur in this area here, where your eyes are, how your eyebrows are. Now, of course, right now with everybody wearing masks, it's probably a good thing for them because they're having to actually focus on that area that they wouldn't normally focus. But they don't use those cues, and they don't always pick up on those cues. But the most important part of it, we can teach them to look at the cues, but we also want them to do something. If we're teaching them to look at those cues, we want to teach, well, when this happens, this is what we probably need to be doing, because they get bogged down in details that might be irrelevant. And I'd like to also talk a moment here about the whole idea of eye contact. Okay, my having eye contact on you is for your benefit. It's not as much for my benefit if I'm a person who's neurodiverse. And the reason why is that process of looking at eyes, other people's eyes, especially a lot of eyes all at once, is a sensory it's overstimulated from a sensory perspective. And I've had many adults tell me that to look at people straight on in the eyes is like looking at a bright light. Doesn't make sense to us neurotypicals, but it makes sense when you talk about how they're neurodiverse and their brains are wired differently. But it's important to be able to look at people. That's a really important social skill, not just in the classroom, but just anywhere that they're going to be. So we need to understand that it's very hard for them, and we need to teach them to look in our direction and not necessarily look us in the eye. And we never, ever force them to look in the eye. I had a mother call me yesterday about her daughter who was meeting with the resource specialist, and the resource specialist was insisting literally, and this is a 6th grader, making her head go like this, "You need to look at me." And this, and then as the girl was getting more and more anxious and upset, she was saying, "Well, you're just being, you know, a problem, and you're being non-compliant," and all these things. And the mom was like, if she just hadn't forced her to look her in the eye in that moment, the whole situation would have been much different. So I agree. I'm a social thinker. I feel better if you're looking at me, and this is really hard for me to be doing this on Zoom, because I'd be looking at an audience and I'd be getting, you know, some input from you. But they don't have to look at you to hear you. It's like my friend Alex said, the words come from the mouth. So if we can remember that, or just keep that when we're working with these students, I think it kind of helps us go, okay, it's not that they're trying to be non-compliant or offensive. The other part that happens, and this is key, and I've had so many children tell me this, teens and even adults. If you want to get a message to them of what they need to be doing, the message has to come without the emotion, because they can't process both. It's very challenging to process both the emotion and the message. We're social thinkers, they take in oh boy, the voice has this staccato to it, you know, all of this is going on. Oh my gosh, all right, what is the message. For a neurodiverse person, when they get a lot of emotion with the message, they may just be reacting to the emotion and losing out on the message. They're not putting it all together in the same way. Still, we need to teach this. I'm not saying we say, okay, they can be this, we can all function with never ever showing an emotion. No, that isn't real life. I want us to be realistic here, but I think we need to understand that if it's a very important message, we need to take our emotion out of it to give that message to them. And then later we can say, as I was telling you all that, this is what I was really feeling. I was feeling really frustrated. I was feeling really disappointed, whatever it was. But it's after you've given that message, because they can't process the two things at once, that really strong emotion. This is how I wish I had all of you here sitting in front of me, or that I was over there sitting in front of all of you. The neurodiverse students process emotions by thinking about past situations and possible meanings, even if they are even aware that there are emotions involved. And at the very end, I'm going to read a quote from Temple Grandin, who was somebody who's very well known in the field of understanding more about autism. And she talks about that. So one of the participants sent through the discussion that they hope that I would talk a bit about mediating. And it is really important. And I think it is usually on the adult to help mediate. And I'm going to talk a little bit about this. But when a difficult situation arises in the classroom or at lunchtime or at recess, it is often necessary for an adult or peer to help the neurodiverse student mediate the situation. Without this mediation, the situation can quickly escalate or become harmful to the student. Oftentimes, what the adult's role is to help figure out the perspectives. Okay, and so the neurotypical peers need the help as much as the neurodiverse student does, because we want to give that meaning to it for the neurotypical kid. So if you have your neurodiverse kid who heard something over here, I have a good example. I have a boy who heard something going on over here with a friend, registered that it was some type of teasing, wasn't able to register it was friendly teasing, and went over and got in between the two. And of course, it escalated very quickly. Adults all came. The assistant principal at that particular school is not real adept at dealing with differences. And, it escalated very quickly. The assistant principal got some things thrown at her. And, anyway, when we got down to the bottom of it, it was this misinterpretation of teasing that was going on with a friend. And if an adult could have come in and said, oh, I think what's happening is, let's look at this. This is friendly teasing going on over here. Do we need to go save or help our friend? Oh, okay, maybe we don't. Okay. Or to say to the other friend, oh, Joey over here, he thought you were being teased and it was mean teasing and he wanted to help you out. Isn't that cool that he wanted to help you out? So that you're helping to facilitate on both sides and you're giving meaning to whatever is the situation. When mediating, the first goal should be to cause no further anxiety or stress to the student. Individual needs will vary based on the student and the situation, but keep in mind, prolonged conversation, talking about eye contact or confrontation, can cause high levels of sensory anxiety. And so what often happens, like that assistant principal, I often say the adults can make the problem, can make the situation so much worse. And that's what, why are you doing this? Why did this happen? You're going to have suspension, blah, blah, blah. And it just raised this kid's anxiety level to a very high level. And then unfortunately, some things happen. So that's what we mean by the mediation, is kind of giving the meaning to the neurotypicals. I think maybe what he was trying to do is help you out here. That's really cool. That's being a cool friend. And to the other kid, I think what you were reading was probably not the right, the right way of reading the situation, or right way, or got the idea of the situation. And a best case scenario would be for the student to have a friend that acts as an ally or an advocate. And I always ask in meetings, in every IEP meeting, I always ask, who's this kid's safe person? Sometimes it's the teacher. Sometimes it's the janitor. Sometimes it's the assistant principal. Sometimes it's another kid. And they can identify, this person gets me. This is my safe friend. So it's always important to know who that person is. And again, about perspective, one of the questions, intake questions I always ask when I'm meeting a client for the first time is I ask them what they like, what do they like to do? I ask them what they like to eat. I ask them, like to travel or whatever it might be. And then I'll turn and I'll say, I see your mom sitting here. Tell me something about your mom. I don't know. Well, describe your mom. They'll say, well, she's nice. And I'll say, well, what's their favorite food to eat? I don't know. She never tells me. Okay, well, how do we know what people like if we're a social thinker? We watch. Okay, that person, every day when they sit down in the lunchroom, they eat a Snickers bar. Okay, so we can make an assumption they like a Snickers bar. Maybe they don't. We can ask them, do you like it? No, it's just what I have around. But the point is, we do that observation, and we, as a social thinker, we're doing that observation and we're making assumptions, and then we can answer questions. What is your mom's favorite food to eat? Humor. We had in the Friends Club room, this is what we had up. Is it not this? I thought this was cute. It's just hide and seek, Brian, and you don't have to call it fleeing to an undisclosed location. But anyway, we had this up in the Friends Club room because I like to tell the joke over and over again. The first time is funny. The second time is not so funny. And the third time is annoying. And we had a boy that had come to Friends Club for the first time. He's about 8 years old. And he went and he left and he told his mom, he says, I'm not coming back. And the mom says, why not? And he said, well, because the second time isn't going to be so funny. And the third time I go is going to be annoying. So we had to teach him that it had to do with telling jokes. So, because he was reading the detail, but he wasn't reading the big picture. You may have heard of this, but it's something that is a phrase that was used in the late 90s, the hidden curriculum, and teaching the hidden curriculum. And that includes the setting, the audience, and awareness of themselves in that setting. I have a great story of how social stories came to be. And Carol Gray is the person who had kind of come up with social stories. And this was back in the late 90s, I believe. And she tells the story on how they came, in that she was working at a high school in Jenison, I think it was Missouri or Michigan. She is Michigan. And she was working in a high school, and she had this boy that went to a lot of gen ed classes, but he would always interrupt. He would sit in the front, the teacher would go to talk, and he would blurt out, and others didn't get to answer, and it was a problem. So they had him go and talk to Carol because she was going to, figure out what was going on. And, she went through the list of social skills, and she went through, this is what you need to do when you're in a class, and all of this. And she went to observe him in class, and he was still doing it. He was still just blurting out and the answers, and really being disruptive. So she did something different. She videotaped what was going on, and then she brought him in to watch the videotape. And as he's watching the videotape, she asked him something. She said, who is the teacher talking to? And he says, me, of course. And she said, but how many other students are in the class? And he said, I don't know. And he went back and he counted. And she said, so how many people are in the class? And he was able to say, she said, so who do you think was the audience? Who do you think that teacher was talking to? Oh, all of us. Okay. And so, and then she, went through, and when you're blurting it out, what's happening for the other students? And he was able to see that he was being disruptive. So he said, stop. I got to go back to class. I got to go back to class right now. I need a piece of paper. And he went running back to class, and Carol followed him. And he said to the teacher, got to put my desk over here by the wall. The teacher was like, is this the solution, Carol? Carol said, okay. And he wrote out for him, when the teacher is talking, they're talking to everybody. I need to listen and raise my hand if I want to talk. And he posted that next to his desk. Now, he still had times where he blurted out because he was just so excited about whatever was the topic. But for the most part, he was no longer so disruptive. What happened there? Him writing down and understanding the setting and the audience and themselves in that setting was really powerful and helped them to understand it. In curriculum, I used to say, when parents, as kids move up and they get a new teacher every year, I used to say that it's a good idea to go in and find what the teacher was like. Did they like the homework to be done on time, or did they give extra time for homework? If you're taking a test, or you're going, different things about how the teacher taught. And I had a principal say, no, that's kind of cheating. And I said, no, those are things kids figure out in the very beginning, first day or two of school. They kind of figure out the teacher's rules. These neurodiverse kids, they don't. It takes them a couple of months to figure out the rules. Why not give them the rules up front so they can be so much more successful? And it was brought to mind when I dropped my daughter off at middle school. She had gone to an ice cream social, and the next day it was time to drop her off, and she jumps out of, literally jumps out of the car before I even had stopped to get off to where she was going. And I watched her and I thought, she knows exactly where she's supposed to be. She knows exactly what she's supposed to be doing, who she's supposed to be hanging with. She's got all that figured out from an ice cream social. How did that happen? And I thought about my clients, and I thought about how much time it takes them to get all that information. If we can kind of give them the hidden curriculum ahead of time, how much better prepared they are and how much more successful they can be. So parents will often write a one-page, for the new teacher, about their student. But it would be nice if the teacher would also do the same thing. For teaching setting, I really like the game. I don't know if you've seen this. It's not teaching setting, excuse me. For teaching setting, a couple of different things that I've done for little kids, teaching name, goose to make them aware of themselves with others, which is really fun. It's just duck, goose, but I call it name, goose, so they learn each other's names. I like to also, when kids are just kind of talking this way and they're talking to this kid over here, I like to come up and say, not sure who you're talking to. Can you give me an idea? So we teach that in the setting and the audience. And then a really fun game that we used to do in Friends Club, it was the most popular, was apples to apples. And the cool thing about apples to apples is it's, you match like nouns to adjectives or adverbs or things like that. But in doing so, you teach the student to think about whoever is the judge and how they would think about things. What do you think is going to be funny to them? Not necessarily about you, but you're teaching them to think about somebody else and their what they like. Sensory differences. Michelle Garcia Winner came up with teaching about things that are cool versus not cool, having weird thoughts, expected versus unexpected behaviors, and then also a need for alone time. So I want to talk about cool versus not cool or weird thoughts. Michelle Garcia Winner does a lot around social thinking. There's a lot of books that she has out, a lot of programs. I think she's even done several workshops in Hawaii. And one of the things that she likes to teach kids that are neurodiverse is that sometimes the things that they're saying or doing are Unexpected. What I found in working with upper elementary and middle school kids is teaching them cool versus not cool. This is cool, this is not cool. And not in a judgmental way, but in a way to let them know kind of what other kids think is cool. And so, for example, talking about over and over again the same video game, that's not cool. It's cool to kind of talk about different kinds of video games that kids would like, because these kids get so hyper focused. I don't like the expression weird thoughts because it puts a judgment on it, but it is something that Michelle Garcia Winter talks about. And then she talks about the expected versus unexpected behaviors. And then a little bit about screen time. I think it's really important to share my thoughts on that, because I'm often asked this about parents. Do I take away all screen time? No. Screen time was developed by people that are neurodiverse and are used a lot by people that are neurodiverse, because it's their alone time. It's their time that they don't have to be paying attention to social. The sensory things tend to be alleviated, interestingly enough, during the screen time. However, I do think screen time for all children needs to be limited, and it needs to be set up as, you know, not something they're doing all the time. And believe me, the last couple of years has only made it worse. But the need for alone time for kids that are neurodiverse, I think, is very important. And there is time that I do think that they need to be able to just shut everything that's kind of coming at them, especially when they're at school, and have a little bit of that screen time. But I do believe that it needs to be limited. It needs to be put in a schedule, because they follow schedules very well. And I believe that it can also be used. I like to tell parents that it's a good idea to say, okay, you're going to get 45 minutes every day of screen time, no matter what. You're going to get 45 minutes. However, in order to earn any extra screen time, you're going to need to go out and do an exercise or walk the dog or get a chore done. So they know that they're always going to get that 45 minutes. So you're not going to have a constant berate, you know, oh, when do I get my iPad, or when do I get my screen time? But they also know that they're using it almost like an exchange, a currency for other things that they need to do that are non-preferred things. That's just my take on that. And I'm looking at the time, and we're getting close. Allowing for movement is really important. Running an errand. You know, you got a kid that just needs that movement. Well, they can go up to take something to the office for you. Move or push something heavy, of course, appropriate. Being able to stand at the desk, again, allowing for movement must always be appropriate. We got to make sure that we do that in there. Anxiety on the spectrum, we need to link the anxiety to the behavior, and to link the social failures to the anxiety. A lot of their anxiety is, it's unfortunate, because that neurodiverse side of the spectrum, the neurodiverse side of the population, they are aware that they are different, and there is anxiety that comes with that. It is experienced 24/7. Treating with logic helps. Teaching them to breathe and count. A little 5-year-old, I kind of taught her to use the timer on her mom's phone, and it was the time, and she's so cute doing it. Doing that breathe, what we tell ourselves too, and what our Apple Watches tell us to do. It's time to breathe, and self-advocating is necessary. I think, Jim, since we're so close to the end, I'd like to see what some of the questions are. I'm sorry, you've done it as a chat.
Yeah,
I'm
no,
so
you were doing so well. Everybody was engaged and focused, and I didn't want to interrupt. But we do have a couple of questions. I know we are running out of time, but the focus on several of the questions is how do we help older students? So I think this is more towards high school and things like that. I can pass on the rest of the questions, but I think that's one of it is how do we assist those older students?
Well, here, the best thing that I can tell you is we can't take, they take what we say literally because they have literal language, but we can't always take what they say literally. So if a kid says, I'm going to try to keep it pretty tame here, but if a kid says, I just hate my life, I just hate whatever, I'm going to say, instead of getting into a whole discussion about, well, we don't want you to hate your life and, getting all that, I'm going to say to the neurodiverse, I think what you're trying to say is things are really not going your way today. What can we do to help? Because I think what we do as adults, and we do it very well, and it works okay for the majority of the kids in that bell curve, is we take the words that they're saying and we go, okay, I got to fix it based on what they're saying. But what they really might be saying is something completely different. And we have to interpret that. That's one thing that I can say about the older kids. The other thing I can say about the older kids is that oftentimes when they tell me, I don't need friends, I don't want friends, I'll come back with, I think what you're trying to say is it's really hard to make friends. And I'm here to help. And I know people that are here to help. I think that's an important piece of it. The other thing you have to remember about the older kids, and I see there's a question about what if the parents won't accept the autism, and I know that that is just so challenging. And I do talk about it in my book, about by the time they're 8 or 9, I do think they need to be told that they have autism, and I go into all my reasonings in the book. But by the time they're older and in high school, and if they haven't gotten services or they haven't got intervention, they're really angry. They're really angry. And there's a lot that creates that anxiety. And I think we have to remember that we have to treat that anxiety. Anyway, and have successful social interactions. Okay, was there other ones, Jim, that you thought?
Those were the two biggest ones.
Okay.
I know everybody would probably just stay here and we'd talk all day, but I'm going to get yelled at if I don't.
If you do,
everybody gets into the next sessions.
Yeah, here's what I offer, and it's on the handouts, but how to get a hold of me is on the handouts. And if you have a specific question, I don't like to answer questions about specific children, but I do, if you have that general question, parents, helping them to understand autism or whatever, go ahead and email me, drcynthianorall@gmail.com. I do have my website. I have some resources on my website. And then there is also the Quirky Yes, Helpless No website. And that has a lot of resources for teaching social.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Cynthia Norall. Thank you, everybody, for your participation and attention. At this time, please return to the ACCE 2022 website to view our generous sponsors and talk with other fellow attendees on the discussion boards until the next session begins. And I believe the next start time is going to be 12:35. Thank you very much for the talk, and everybody, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.